Delighted to see all of you. Welcome to the presentation as part of our 300th anniversary celebration here. And I'm really delighted to see so many people here. Thank you. I'm indeed town warden, and as we talked about a little bit before, my proper title is interim church historian. The chair is open. Glad to mentor anybody who wants to take that mantle on. I wanted to thank a number of people. You never really get very far in life without a lot of help. First person I want to thank is my wife, Donna, for putting up with me for a long time. and especially over the last couple of weeks while I was diving into a lot of the really interesting historical things, trying to validate some facts, investigate some urban legends around the church, and to fill the inboxes and message trays of lots of people associated with the church with, oh, I found this, and did you know about that, or do you know about that? So I hope this is a useful and enjoyable time for you here. I'd also like to thank Karen Henderson from Westborough TV, and in fact, thank Westborough TV in its aggregate for quite a long time. They've been playing back our services every Monday at 6, I believe, and that's been very helpful for us to have that avenue to get our worship experience out to the broader community. As far as the process for the presentation here, if you have questions, you can raise them during the presentation unless things get rowdy. We don't have a microphone for the audience, so I'll need to repeat your question, so make it short and succinct, so that I can remember what the question was. But I will try to take questions along the way. The title for the presentation is one that Kathy Acorn came up with, 300 Years in Counting. And what we're really going to be focusing on are the changes in our physical plan, primarily this church building, or the church buildings, over 300 years. Get this piece of technology to cooperate. There we go. Let's try that. So there are a number of people whose work I've drawn upon here, and I tried to be complete here with the acknowledgments. You can see it's a wide range of people, from the town historical librarian to some of the folks who've been historians in the past as well. And I'm really grateful for the help that people have provided and the information which I've been able to draw on. So I don't think it's any mystery at this point that people are probably aware that Westborough was originally formed as a section of Marlborough, the larger Marlborough colony, the Westborough part, and I think this is a bit bigger so I could read it. There we go. And Lake Chauncey was really the center of it, and it was. The original Westborough included Westborough as well as Northborough. We'll talk about how Northborough came to be. But there were also pieces added from Shrewsbury and Sutton to kind of build out Westborough over time. And what this indicates on the map here is the location of the first meeting house. And spoiler alert, we're in the third meeting house at this point. We'll talk about how we got here. But you can see that the first meeting house was really pretty centrally located in the geography of what was Westborough at the time. And it's, as a picture from Marcia Hoffman shows us, there's actually, at least I think it may still be there, a marker on Powder Hill near Spectrum House on Oak Street that shows the location of the first meeting house. So I do have a guest presenter here.
In 1717, when Westborough became incorporated as a town, they were required to build a meeting house. So the following year, they decided they would build the meeting house on Powder Hill, which is where the present-day Lyman School was. And that was at that time the center of the town. It took a while in those days because they had to do the work and they didn't have time. They had their own farming and that to take care of. So by 1720, the first meeting was held in the structure. It was a barn-like building. It had no floors and no seats. And it wasn't until 1724 that it was finally completed in time for the ordination of the town's first minister, Reverend Ebenezer Parkman.
So, for size comparison, what is known today in our addition on the back of the house of this building is the Parkman Chapel, was built to be the same size as that first meeting house, 40 feet by 30 feet. And I always credit Brad Ridley for the one who said, you know, this is built that size. And those who have ventured into the chapel, been there for services and so forth, know that Parkman's original pulpit, pine pulpit, is in fact in the chapel and was used for our summer services and other things as well. And there's a commemorative plaque shown here that's on that pulpit. The seating in that first meeting house was done by what's called station. There were 2 or 3 areas around the outside were what were called pew spots. Now these were actually locations in the building that were bought by some of the people in town, some of the members of the church. And you can look at some of the names here, very old, long-standing names in Westborough history. And those families would design and build their own square pews with walls around them. They owned them. That's the spot that they always sat in. Now, those people who couldn't afford to buy their pews but were still sort of honored members of the community sat on the benches, and sort of the greater the dignity and honor of the people, the closer to the front, to the pulpit, that they would sit. As it says, it was assigned by age and wealth, which often went together. A little bit later in that same meeting house, there was a gallery, because this was about 18 feet tall. There was a gallery built across the back to add extra seating on another upper level. And I've tried to indicate, if you are thinking of trying to conceive of how this fits within the Parkman Chapel, on the right-hand side, or that's the exterior doors. And if you want to compare it to our sanctuary today, it would fit very neatly. In fact, maybe 2 of them would fit neatly in the sanctuary upstairs today. And again, just to orient you, because I'll show this diagram a couple of times, on the left-hand side would be the Main Street entrance, and these are the stairs that go up the back on the right-hand side.
20 years later, the town was divided into precincts. There were 2 precincts. The first precinct, the boundaries corresponded basically to present-day Westborough, but that left the meeting house in the very northern corner of the precinct. So that by 1748, when the town center had moved closer to where it is now, they decided they'd better make a new meeting house. So they built one between present-day Milk Street and Summer Street. Now, they had their first meeting there in 1749, but at that time it was barely covered over, and a year later, Ebenezer was still writing in his diary of the cold winds that blew through the church or the meeting house, and also whenever it rained and he was preaching, his head would get wet. So it wasn't until 1755 that it was finally completed, and they added a pulpit and the stairs for the gallery, and they painted it inside and out. There was still no heat, the same as in the first meeting house. In 1801, Samuel Parkman, Ebenezer Parkman's son, gave a bell to the town, so that required building a tower onto the building to house the bell. And about 5 years later, they had raised enough money so they could purchase a clock to also add to that tower.
So here's another sketch of what the second meeting house looked like. And as if you sort of can visualize the location information that Helena was conveying, that's essentially today's Rotary, right on the Rotary. The second meeting house was somewhat bigger. It was 50 feet by 40 feet. It was 23 feet high, so it was higher. And in 1773, they actually added 14 more feet to the length of the house, of the meeting house, just to accommodate more folks. They were reluctant to tear down the first meeting house, even though they finally concluded that they would need to have those materials in order to build the second one. So that's why the first meeting house doesn't exist anymore.
Was it on the circular rotary or one of the, do they know the location of it?
Well, so the question, yeah, we'll get to the exact location in a little bit. There's a side story to that, which we'll go into. Good question. Now, even this meeting house, though, would still fit inside today's sanctuary upstairs, to give you some idea. And I find it always interesting when I'm in the sanctuary to kind of visualize, say, oh, that would fit in here? Okay. All right. And then it was extended, I believe it was extended lengthwise. The documentation says it was split in the middle. And I've never really figured out where the middle was. So I'm going to share with you my assumption that meant it was lengthened. So in the second meeting house, there was still seating by station. And again, there were pew spots, and just like in the first meeting house, areas were designated and sold. People would construct their own pews. And there were also benches, and like eventually in the first meeting house, there was a gallery across the back. But again, this was a fairly high structure. So there was room basically for a balcony across the back. So in 1740s, late 1740s, with the meeting house now being located in, like, just down the street from where we are today, the people who were in the northern part of town, that was a long hike for them, a long trip, and they were required to come, multiple times a week for meetings, for services, and things like that. And they grew tired of that. So they began to take steps in order to be recognized as their own town, and eventually in 1766, Northborough was recognized as a separate town. And in fact, as it says here, the Westborough borders have not changed since 1766. This also indicates now the centrality, if you will, of the location of the second meeting house within today's Westborough. Now, part of Ebenezer Parkman's contract was that if the meeting house ever moved more than a mile away from the first one, the town was obligated to build him another parsonage. His original parsonage was right next door to the first meeting house. But with the meeting house moved, he now had to go over a mile to get to the church. So the town was obligated to build him another parsonage. They originally built it at the corner of East Main Street and High Street, which is where the mobile station is now on Main Street. And then it was moved up the hill in 1867 to its present location. Some of the history on the house, Parkman was criticized at the time for the size of the windows. That people saying it wasn't becoming that a pastor should have a house with such big windows. And eventually he kind of admitted, yeah, probably pretty big. Later, this house was owned by Wood Bodman, right? Sorry. Who was associate pastor here for a few years, and is now currently owned by the family of Karen Henderson, who's videoing for us this evening for us for the TV. So mention was made of the Paul Revere bell, and as Helena said, that was donated by Samuel Parkman, who was one of Ebenezer had like 13 children. It was donated to the town by Samuel Parkman. Originally, the townspeople said, we don't want to build a tower on the house, this meeting house. But when they got the bell, they said, well, I guess we need to build a belfry. And they built the tower. This was, and later on we'll talk a bit about what happened in 1837, but that bell eventually passed on to the Baptist congregation here in town. And it was loaned to them and then finally sold to them in 1849. So they took actual possession of the bell. Most of us know the Baptist church here in town closed in 2007. And eventually that Paul Revere bell was sold and installed at the Old South Meeting House in Boston. Not the church, but the one that's downtown. Now, I did my best, it's not very well, to make a recording of kind of what that bell actually sounds like. So this is about the best I'm able to do for you. We tried to match it with some of the bells from our handbell set without success. So if there are some folks who are listening to this who have perfect pitch, they can say, that's whatever. Let us know. We'll see if we can have sort of a more interesting recording that emulates that Paul Revere bell. This is a sketch which is taken from a book called The 100th Town, which was written by Harriet Forbes, who was a member of the church. She published this in 1921, and shows some interesting places in town. There's the second meeting house on the far right. Next to it was Breck Parkman's store. Breck was a very successful merchant, son of Ebenezer Parkman. Next to that was the schoolhouse, and the Avidia Bank was what became the Avidia Bank, and now it's Westborough TV's studio, is on the site of that first schoolhouse, right next to the burying ground or the town cemetery. So it's and these are over on the far right, horse sheds. Yeah, and there were horse sheds all around the church too for a long time. So,
you're going to get to this. Do we know where this current bell came from?
Yeah, I do have some background on that. Yeah, right. That question about the current bell. Yeah, right. So in 1834, some major stuff began to happen here in town. The first was that the railroad came through town, literally through town. And the railroad track ran exactly right by that second meeting house, right up Summer Street. Came in, if you can imagine where the track is now, it's much closer to the center of town. Ran right by, right up next to the Rotary, and then on out of town. So it was very disruptive to any kind of worship service, especially in the second meeting house. The tracks were eventually rerouted about 1899, more or less where they are today. And that wonderful bridge we have over Main Street, reach up and touch, was constructed, I think, in 1933. So I'll give you some idea. But the townspeople took great advantage of the railroad because Westborough was a major supplier of milk for Boston, and also carnations and various kinds of flowers that were grown here. So it was for commerce, it was great. For a meeting house right next to it, not great.
But by 1834, there was a sharp division between the members of the meeting house, between those who believed in the Trinitarian theory and those who believed in the Unitarian theory. And this led to a final separation. The Unitarians received the present meeting house at that time, and the Trinitarians purchased the land on the corner of Church Street and West Main Street, and that they built their new meeting house there.
So this is a picture that shows the second meeting house after the split, after 1837. It was sold When the split happened in 1834, the Baptists, they'd all been one town church up to that point, and eventually very quickly split into Baptists, Unitarians, and Congregationalists, or Trinitarians. The meeting house was sold in 1837. It stayed with the Baptists, it stayed with the Unitarians. And, but for a few years they tried to use it for worship, and then they in fact sold the building. The church records and the communion service set went with the Trinitarians, which is like we got that. So the bell tower was removed. There were porches on this building. Those got taken away and used in people's homes here in town. And the building was raised one floor. And we'll talk more about building raising shortly. And by raising it one floor, what they built underneath was a commercial arcade, a whole series of shops. Okay, and it became known as the Arcade Building. So this is a picture from about 1880. Talked about, somebody said, is this on the Rotary? Well, this is kind of what the Rotary looked like in 1880. Okay, you can look on the right side. You can see the arcade building. Further down the street in the distance, you can see the steeple of this church. On the left-hand side, you can see the steeple of the Baptist church. And actually, I think some of these buildings are still there. But to give you some idea of what the Rotary looked like about 1880. In about 1890, though, the people who owned the old arcade building realized that they really just couldn't maintain it anymore. It was becoming decrepit. So it was demolished. And through the collection of Phil Kittredge, we have this picture of the building while it was being demolished. Some people, urban myth is that it burned, it got deconstructed. But it was about 140 years old at the time. And the arcade building, the brick building, is constructed on that same site. So let's back up again to 1834, which was when the Trinitarians constructed a church on this site where we are today. The property cost them $1,000. It was bought from Sarah Sanborn. She had a house on this property. That house was moved down to the corner of Cross and Central Streets. There's 4 houses there. I have no idea which one was actually the one that was off this property. If somebody knows, let me know. The structure was, the picture of the church that's shown here is actually after the 1869 improvements, which we'll talk about at length. But the original building, if you kind of imagine this, was just the first floor of this with a smaller steeple and a smaller front. So it was really just one floor, which was the sanctuary, which is above us, and the balconies up there. That was all there was to the church. So they were still seating people by station, still buying pews, or there was a monetary transaction for pews in the sanctuary. This diagram is actually from 1834, when the first church's third meeting house, this one, was actually constructed. And you can see on the right-hand side are assignments for box pews, and these are basically straight bench areas, straight pews. And we'll talk about what we have today a little bit later. And the left-hand side shows the assignments that were in the balcony. So basically all these names indicate people who paid for those seating areas. And there were even some on either side of the pulpit, you see over on the far right. So there are pew numbers for each one, so it was all designated and worked out in the plan. I just want to draw your attention to one of the names, David Warren, who was associated with pew number 35 on that diagram that we just saw. And in the records, we have the actual deed to David Warren for pew number 35 in the meeting house. It was $156 then, and which is about $4,100 today, given inflation. But it was perpetual ownership. So the deed says to David Warren and his heirs. So once you sort of pay it once, and then you own that spot in the church.
Okay.
Now, in 1869, there were a whole series of renovations that followed the Civil War. One of the first ones I'll talk about is that the curved pews, which we have in the sanctuary today, replaced all of those boxed pews. But if you look carefully in the floor, and the picture on the left shows this, you can still see little rectangular patches where the framework from those boxed pews was removed and patched. And now that we've refinished the floor, a lot of those are visible. So you can examine that as you walk through the church. These pews, and this diagram on the right shows from 1870, right after the curved pews were put in. All of the pews that were available, both in the balconies as well as on the main floor, and what the charges would be for those pews. Now, at this point, they began to pay annually a rental rather than ownership, in most cases, as far as I can tell. One of the figures on this diagram shows that if these pews were bought, the total value would be about $24,000, which is over half $500,000 today.
Until about 1910. The church was supported by pew charges, not an annual drive, but by pew charges. If you wanted to have a pew for yourself and your wife or husband, you rented a pew for 2 people. And the first of the year, you put in your money. And all the pews in the right and the left, the center section upstairs, were divided with those little armrests you see there today. Some was for 2, some was 3, some for 4. And the end of each of those pews was a nice brass number, 3 inches high, 2 inches across, and 1 inch thick. And so you knew that you might have had number 25. And so when you come to church in the morning, we always had ushers to take you to your seats back in those days. You say, my number is 25. They'd take you to your seat. It was always nobody ever sat in that seat because it was yours. And if you never came to church, that seat would still be vacant. Now, those that didn't wish to pay for a pew charge and visitors sat in the center section or up in the balcony. Well, that continued until about 1910. And then they decided they'd do away with it and had the annual drive for funds.
So, interestingly enough, even though Frank says that ended in 1910, just last week, I was picking up things here in the library back here, and I came across this framed document, which is shown on the diagram here on the screen. Basically, what this is a document that consigns to, in this case, the Kirkside Corporation, a gift of any value that might still be associated with pew number 98, which had been purchased some time ago by Susan Mason Parker. I haven't been able to find out much about her, but her daughter signed over whatever value there might still be in pew 98 as a gift. I found it pretty amazing. So there were more changes in 1869, and Frank is going to give us some more information.
Well, that little church continued until 1869 as the Evangelical Society. And in 1869, they decided that they needed more space. So they said, let's jack up the church and put a room underneath. We want a room where we can have church suppers like this, or socials. So before they jacked the church up, they took the steeple that was on the church off, and they removed those windows because they were plain glass, and there was afraid as they jacked the church that windows would break. So removed those 12 windows off the church. Well, back in 1869, they certainly didn't have hydraulic jacks like we had when we lifted the roof of this building 25 years ago. They had the old-fashioned screw-type jacks. So they placed about 15 to 20 of them around the perimeter of this building. And there was a person to man each jack. And on a certain command from somebody, they would each turn a complete turn, and the building would go up 1 inch. And they continued it again and again till the building was up 1 foot. Now those jacks didn't go any higher. So they would have to shore up the building, move the jacks up 1 foot, and do the whole thing again. And that went through till they got the building up 7 feet high. Then they built the vestry underneath.
That's the room we're in, for those people who are not familiar with the church. 1869. Right.
Yeah.
So it's amazed me that there are no pictures that I've been able to find, everybody can just have, of the church being raised as Frank described. And I thought, well, why is that? And because it was certainly, the era where they had a lot of photography, Matthew Brady, and Civil War and stuff like that. But then I realized this was old hat. This was not a big deal to raise a building, 7 feet and build underneath. The old arcade had been done like that in 1842 after it was sold. The first town hall, which is on the site of the present town hall, it was raised in 1867 in a similar manner. And then the Congregational Church was raised in 1869. Yeah, right? And in fact, in 1860 in Chicago, an entire city block was raised in this way. So it's like, no big deal. I often also wondered why, if they needed more room, why didn't they build on top of what they had? And my reasoning is that they knew that the structure as it sat, not before it was raised, could hold up whatever was above it, like the roof. And a lot of the roofs were slate then, right? So it was a pretty substantial structure. If they were to add more to the top of the building, it's conceivable, to my mind, that what was down below might not support all of that weight. But if they basically raised what was there and built underneath it, good chance that what was holding up the upper stories would continue to do so. So there's my theory. Now, while we're sitting here, as I said, this room was created by raising the building, but Frank says 7 feet, but it's probably more than that. Behind this paneling that you see in front of you under the screen are the timbers which were added to create these walls and support the rest of the church once it was raised. And if you look carefully at the pictures you see here, like in the upper right, there's no brackets, there's no metal to hold that stuff together. It's mortised joints of 6x6 and 8x8 timbers, and it's held together. So we do have several pictures when these were when David Smith was working on the wainscoting. Took several pictures, so we have some idea kind of what that structure all looks like in here. But it's pretty fascinating. The other thing that I want to point out is when the building was built, it was built on what is called a rubble foundation, which is basically rocks that are all piled up. And when the building was raised, I think the lower right-hand picture shows there's a layer of brick that was added on top of that rubble foundation in order to be able to level out the structure at that point. So the variety of building materials that are in the foundation for the church.
And then, of course, they wanted to put the windows back. Well, there were those in the church that didn't want plain glass. They wanted stained glass. And for $50, they could take out the plain glass and put in the stained glass. And so there were people in the church who said, yes, I'll put the $50 up. So for $600, we had all the stained glass put in the church. And that's the stained glass that is there today. Because different families were willing to put up that money to have the stained glass.
Now, those who have been with the church for a while probably know that the glass we have in the windows is not really stained glass, it's etched glass. However, at the top of each one of those windows is a roundel, which is in fact stained glass. And each of those represents a significant aspect of the Christian faith. And our picture directory from 2014 on several of the pages has illustrations of those roundels and the scripture verses that fundamentally describe why that's a significant symbol for the faith. And some of those are shown on the right-hand side here. One more.
Well, then, of course, the front of the church was only where we stepped down those little stairs to come into this vestry. That was the front of that church. That entryway, as you actually come down, was the double doors coming into the church. The little door that you stepped in to go into the choir loft went into a cloakroom. And so, therefore, they had to build about 20 feet out because they had the church built up and had to put stairs up. So they put in the winding stairs, and then they put on those 3 heavy front doors, and they built the 4 columns out in front, and then they put in the granite steps in front, and then at last they put on an 18-foot steeple with a weather vane. And then the front of the church looked like it looks today.
In the historical documents that we have in the church is a stereopticon slide. Now, stereopticon, to kind of bring it into 21st century terms, this was virtual reality in the 19th century. Okay, and if you look at that stereopticon viewer, you get an idea, oh yeah, some of the VR stuff is maybe not that new. Fundamentally, these were picture cards where the same scene was done from slightly different angles. And because of the way that you looked at it through the stereopticon viewer, it had a 3D effect. This particular slide or picture, on close examination, it's amazing how much detail is in this. We're able to figure out this is the decoration of the sanctuary on the 150th anniversary, basically 150 years ago. And in on the poster that's in the middle of the chancel there, the names of the pastors, starting with Parkman, who had been at the church up to that point. And the other thing I'll point out is, if you can look in the upper part of those pictures, you can see that there's a lot of detail in the ceiling, a lot of plaster decoration and very fancy, elegant decoration of the upper part of the church. Okay. And of course, the curved pews. Question over here, yes.
Go back to the slide before.
I'm sorry?
Go back to the slide before.
I'd be glad to go back to the slide. Yes, what's your question?
What's that giant hanging lion?
That's a lamp. Light.
Oh, yeah, see the light?
The chandelier?
The
The
chandelier.
chandelier hanging down from the medallion.
Oh.
Yeah, the question is, what's the hanging thing? There was this the wiggly snake thing there. It's, right. It is the support for a chandelier.
Right.
Probably a gas chandelier at that
Then you
point.
had a light and then pull it back up, I assume.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Good point. They probably had to bring it down to light it and then haul it back up.
Right, thanks.
Good question. You're staying awake. Thank you. Moving ahead a little bit, in 1904, yeah, we had a new organ installed. There had been an organ in, oh, I missed a slide or two. Because I didn't talk about Gardner Parker's clock. Excuse me 1 minute. We didn't talk about Gardner Parker. How did I miss Gardner Parker? I don't know. Well, let me tell you about Gardner Parker. That's in there. All right, I'll come back to this. My apologies. Here we are, and we'll go to the next slide. So, in 1806, Gardner Parker built a clock for the town building. Now, Gardner Parker lived on Mill Street out by the Assabet River. He was a unique individual. He was actually a trained clockmaker, being trained by the Willards over in Grafton, and made many fine clocks. You can find his at pretty expensive. But he also made 3 tower clocks, and these are literally 4 feet by 8 feet by 4 feet high, and the gears were cast iron. He made 3 of these. He made one for the second meeting house. He made another for the Shrewsbury Congregational Church, and a third for the Arlington Congregational Church. The one that was made for Shrewsbury is actually in Old Sturbridge Village on display. The clock that was made for Arlington was destroyed in a fire. The clock that was made for Westborough was sold. Let's see. Yeah, I think it was sold to the town for the first town hall, and then when that was torn down and the present town hall was built, that clock was taken out and it was lost. It was for a long time. It was nobody knew really where it was until a few years ago. It was discovered in the garage of the Spur House over on Parkman Street, behind the police station. And it's like, wow, there it is. Because of its historical value, it's now in the Smithsonian. So, good story about Gardner Parker. He also built the first organ for the church, which is what prompted me to go into that. And that was in 1806. The town took an organ. He never built an organ before, but said, "Yeah, I can build an organ." And it was brought in on loan for a few months, and eventually the town said, "Yeah, we're going to keep it." So from that point on, the church has always had an organ in any of the meeting houses. So when the church built this meeting house, they built an organ into it. In 1904, they decided to buy a magnificent pipe organ and install it at the front of the sanctuary. The original organ had been actually in the back of the sanctuary in what is now the choir loft, and that's what's in this picture here on the slide. But even though they were buying a new pipe organ for the front, they tied the older organ in as an echo organ, so the two worked in concert, so to speak. And as we'll see in a few minutes, there was a machinery box above that organ, which is still up in the above the choir loft. We'll go do some exploring. Okay. So the next series of things go where few people have ventured in the church. We're going to go above the sanctuary.
We're now standing on the attic above the sanctuary. Above that are the trusses which hold this whole roof section up. And if you're downstairs and you look at where the rods go up through the balcony, that indicates where the trusses are. Now, for most building construction, 16 inches on center is maximum. If you take a look at here, we're talking matters of feet between these trusses. It's just a marvel of construction. These beams are made out of chestnut, which is not available anymore. They are not only hold the roof up, but they hold the balconies up. It's just a remarkable piece of construction, which you could never get away with today if you went down to the building inspector and said, "We want to build a church like."
So, again, above the sanctuary, the left-hand side shows you what's actually above today's choir loft. That's a false ceiling that's been built into the choir loft to improve the acoustics to bring the sound out from there. Above that is this framing, and you can see the lights and framing and so forth that's above that false ceiling. And above that is the box that held the machinery for the 1834 organ. Now, if you look sort of the other way from that side toward the back of the church, or that side, the end of the church, I'll call it the back, what you see is the entryway roof from 1834. So the original church did have a smaller steeple on it and an entryway, which is shown here with shingles on it. So when they built the new steeple in 1869, they just left that there. I mean, think about it. During construction, you still need a way to get in and out of the church and protect from the weather, so they left the entryway there. But the structure for the current steeple kind of got built right up through that. There was no need to take it down. Looking at some other details that are under the steeple area of the church, on the upper left-hand side, it's an outside picture that shows part of the trim and the front of the original church, the 1834 church. And if you go on the inside and look at the lower picture, you can see that actually protrudes through the structure of today's steeple, and it kind of like it got cut off. So some part of that is the original church. When they did that, they took the whole front wall off the church in that area, and that's what the center picture shows. But also there are mortised joints from the original church that are held together with pegs, still in our superstructure, up above the sanctuary. They seem to be holding up okay.
This is the mechanism for the fire alarm that was built into this church. There was a little electrical system here, electric magnet, that when it was reactivated, set this whole thing in motion. This cranked up a huge basket of rocks, which were right down in here. And that was the counterweight. And as soon as this thing activated, this arm would go up, and that would be free to go. And then it began to ratchet itself down. As it went down, it took this arm, which is now detached, which went up to the bell. And on the bell was a big hammer, which we'll show you in a minute, that when the arm was activated, the bell would be rung by the arm. Bong, bong. And it rang until all this cable ran out. And that not only alerted people that there was a fire here, but also to come and help. So this is the hammer, which was activated down below, the rod that runs up through. And when the blocks of rocks began to drop, this hammer would go bong, bong, under the huge bell. Beautiful bell. Which normally is just rung with a big rope, which is attached to that big wheel, which rotates the bell back and forth.
Right. So the bell, the question earlier was about our current bell. Current bell was cast in 1861, based on what it says on the ribbon, the apron of the bell, by a company called Hooper. And the Hooper company, the guy who established that company actually was an apprentice with Paul Revere. And he and Paul Revere's grandson were contemporaries, and they both apprenticed in Paul Revere's foundry. And some of the information out there says that the Hooper company bought the Revere foundry. Others says that isn't really true, but fundamentally there was a relationship, pretty much a direct relationship, between Paul Revere and his foundry in bells and the company that made our bell here as well. There you go. So, sort of the next event, which really it was a milestone along the way, was the 1938 hurricane. in 1938, there were no national weather services to kind of track or telegraph the fact that hurricanes were coming. This particular hurricane came across Long Island. It was an immense hurricane. Across Long Island, across Connecticut, and all the way up into Massachusetts. A major destruction all along the way. And I have some interesting video here, which is the aftermath of that hurricane.
Can you fix the sound, Tom?
I'd love to turn the sound on, don't act. I'll play it through a second time, it's pretty short. Yeah. Good firewood, right? So as a result of that hurricane, the original steeple had 3 platforms. The topmost one and the spire got blown off. In fact, got blown back down onto the church itself, created damage on the roof. But the bell and the belfry, which we were looking at, that remained. So it was above that got blown over. So finally in 1957, the members of the church were able to put together $9,000 to put up sort of a replica, if you will, not very accurate replica, of that steeple. Right after the 1938 hurricane, there was some activity in the church to try to replace the steeple, but this was still not long after the effects of the Depression in the 30s. There was rumbles of war in Europe, and eventually which ended up affecting us as well. And so the effort to replace it in 1938, 1939 stalled, and it wasn't until 1957 that this plywood steeple was installed. And at the top of the steeple, on this up in the right-hand side, where the weather vane is, was a round wooden ball, about that size, about the size of a basketball. The lectern from which Rev. Betsy speaks on Sundays, the ball in that is the ball that was on the top of this plywood steeple. And Ed Long and I think who else was involved? Basically, and Bob Brown designed and then constructed that pyramid base to go under the ball as well. So we've preserved that part of the spire for that. In 1964, some other major work was done here, and that is that the church school building, basically the Parkman Chapel, the education wing, and so forth, were added to the church. The design was done by a gentleman named Arland Durlam, who was a noted church architect in the whole New England area. He was associated with Harvard and the architectural school at Harvard, and they in fact have over 400 of his drawings and blueprints. Ours is not among them. We do have those drawings and blueprints, however. So if anybody's interested, we can stretch them out and you can see Arland's name on it. But he was a noted architect. It was not design and build. The chancel was named, as it says here, was named in honor of Paul Teschner, who was led stewardship drives, capital funds drives, and so forth, was really a leading member of the church at the time, who died in a car accident right about that time. So the lower picture shows part of the chapel under construction, and then these are pictures of the program for the dedication of the education wing and the chapel.
Several years ago, looking outside the parking lot, I noticed a bulge on the side of the church. And upon further investigation, it was discovered that this truss was broken and it was just spreading the church apart. So we quickly had to vacate the church, move everything out. We went over to the Masonic Hall for our services for about a year. And then a very intricate process of jacking this whole roof back up by going down to the cellar, taking a hole in the vestry, coming up through the sanctuary, hole there, on up, to jack this back up, and then to build these tremendous steel gussets to reestablish the strength of the trusses which had broken. This was all done by Gus Carlson, who is a member of the church and a tremendous engineer. He designed this whole reconstruction. At the same time, we strengthened all the other trusses down through, so each one of them has a steel plate holding it, which allows us to be a very strong church.
So here's some of the work that was also done that Bob was describing in 1973. He talked about the steel gussets, which reinforce those roof trusses up above the sanctuary. Under the sanctuary and just above this ceiling right here are steel I-beams. And those span where these poles are, here, farther over there, and then we're in the library. So the whole sanctuary above is held up by steel I-beams against the original wood. In the cellar, under this room, were dozens of concrete pillars that were constructed in order to be able to support the weight of this room and the rest of the church as well. As a result of the work that was done, Bob described it of going all the way from the cellar all the way up to the trusses. It basically completed ruining the original plaster ceiling in the sanctuary. And I believe, best of information I have, is at that point, the canvas that covers most of our ceiling, most of our ceiling today in the sanctuary, was installed there rather than trying to restore the ruined plaster ceiling. But there's part of the plaster ceiling, as Brett knows, when he did some drilling through it a few years ago. There is a plaster ceiling, albeit not intact, that's about this far above the canvas. So moving look more toward the present day. In 1994, we conducted a capital funds drive to actually completely replace the steeple. And it was the third platform, the uppermost platform, as well as the spire, were fabricated from fiberglass and added to the church. I think the capital funds drive that year was about $200,000, maybe a bit more, somewhere in that range. The theme was building within, which was to refurbish the steeple and reaching out, because there was a missions component, as we always include in our capital funds drives. And the most recent capital funds drive was in 2008, known as Building on God's Vision. A much more significant remodeling of the sanctuary was undertaken, among other things. These pictures show the sanctuary in a state that I don't doubt any of us will ever see again, which is the pews were completely removed. Yeah, right. And they were stored and refinished while they were stored. But the plan originally was that carpeting would be put down on the sanctuary floor while the pews were out. But once the pews were out, it was determined that the original wood floor was just amazingly beautiful, and the steps was taken to basically refinish that. And now, yes, we have carpeted aisleways, but where all the pews are is the original wood floor refinished today. So that brings us about how we got here tonight in certain ways. There's more to do, and we're looking to have a fundraiser to now clean the fiberglass steeple and make some other secure some other structural things up in the steeple. But this is where it all began. So thank you for attending. And
Thank you.